Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and the bad idea that we have for you this week is one that you have almost certainly heard of, especially if you were born before 1985. We are talking about the automotive legend, the car that launched 1,000 bad car memes, the Yugo.
That was memes before memes, man.
Yeah, before they even had memes, the Yugo was a meme. The Yugo was originally produced in 1977 as the Yugo 45. It was a Fiat-designed car built by the Zavasta Corporation of Yugoslavia. Now, for those of you who weren't familiar with Yugoslavia in 1977, that was a communist country, and we were dead in the middle of the Cold War at the time. However, Yugoslavia, on the scale of bad communist places that we were worried about, was not very high on the list.
Yeah, it was more of a satellite state than anything else. It wasn't even that far into the influence of the Kremlin.
Well, they were not part of the Soviet Union at all. Yugoslavia wasn't part of the Soviet Union, so the Americans were not super worried about them, and they were making these Yugos, giving them out to their people in their communist country, providing jobs in these factories where these terrible cars were made. You got them when you ordered them. Like, you didn't get to specify any custom stuff or color or whatever. You just said, I want a car. And the communists said, all right, give us a few months and maybe you'll get one. And if it had not been for a man named Malcolm Bricklin, you probably would have never heard of the Yugo. It would have been an automotive footnote from some podunk little country from way across the ocean. No big deal. They just drove it around in communist countries, and that's all good. But Malcolm Bricklin had a dream. And Malcolm Bricklin's dream was to make a lot of money.
That's why he ended up founding Subaru of America, but, you know, that's a different story from his Yugo adventures.
Well, we're going to actually, I want to talk about that, okay? I want to give the whole Malcolm Bricklin breakdown here, because Malcolm Bricklin starts out with a franchise operation that he called Handyman America. And his idea in this operation was to sell franchise licenses for these stores that he was going to produce for hardware stores. And once he had enough money from the people buying the franchises, he would then buy a warehouse, fill it with tools, send the tools out to the people that bought the franchise, and have a little retail empire. Except Malcolm Bricklin never amassed enough funds to actually build the warehouse. So he had sold all of these franchises to people who, I guess for some reason, believed in him that he could make this business out of nothing, and then he couldn't. What does Malcolm Bricklin do? Well, he takes the money that he has left that he did not spend building and filling a warehouse with tools, and founds Subaru of America. Now, you're probably thinking, oh, wow, so this guy starts out pretty bad. But, I mean, he rebounded, and that's cool, because you've all heard of Subarus. Subaru's a pretty good car name at this point.
Yeah, especially in Colorado, where it's like every third car is a Subaru and the other third are Jeeps.
That's not the Subaru that Malcolm Bricklin was bringing to America. Malcolm Bricklin, with his ill-gotten gains, was bringing one of the worst cars that anyone has ever built to America. And keep in mind, I'm saying this in an episode about the Yugo, the Subaru 360. Why did Malcolm Bricklin want to bring the Subaru 360 to America? Because it weighed less than 1,000 pounds, Tony.
And at the time, that made it so that it would be standardized as a motorcycle instead of a motor vehicle.
Even though it was a fully enclosed, and I'm going to put air quotes here, car that was just the worst.
I mean, let's be real. This thing looks like basically the runt of a litter of VW bugs.
He did. He brought it to America because he was like, I won't have to worry about the safety standards. It's under 1,000 pounds. We're all good. He sold it with the logo, the Subaru 360, cheap and ugly does it.
That's a great way to sell it. Cheap and ugly does it. At least he's not lying to himself.
He was only selling it for $1,297, which even back then I would say was a pretty cheap car.
Yeah. I wish I could get a brand new car for that. That'd probably be like, what, like $3,000 or $4,000 nowadays?
I'm sure, at least. Unfortunately, this also did not go super well for Malcolm Bricklin. In fact, sales were so bad, Tony, that he took the surplus Subaru 360s that he had and tried to franchise a national chain of go-kart tracks where you could race the Subaru 360 around the track.
I mean, honestly, that sounds like more fun than just having it as a daily driver.
I would imagine. This also failed, however, and eventually he sold his operations as Subaru of America to people who could actually turn it into a successful company. Malcolm Bricklin had other things on his mind. He's failed at being a hardware store magnate. He's failed at importing terrible cars. So he decides, I'm going to make my own car. So Malcolm Bricklin goes to Canada, of all places, to produce a car he called the Bricklin. Apparently the Canadians super bad needed some economic stimulus because they forked over many, many millions of dollars for this shyster to build a factory and produce this car that was made, the exterior anyway, was made entirely from acrylic and fiberglass.
Well, the fiberglass exterior isn't that uncommon. Like, even old model Corvettes had fiberglass exteriors, but they had the frame to be able to work with that. It was just a way to make the car a little bit lighter.
Well, and at the time it was revolutionary. So you're working with a relatively new process. And Malcolm Bricklin, despite his import adventures, had never built a car. I think you can guess where this is going. It was not super great. He declared bankruptcy in Canada in 1979 for like the third point in this story. He's got creditors chasing him from all of his other previous failed ventures that he sold franchise opportunities into because he keeps rolling his money over. And here's where we get to Malcolm Bricklin and his most famous failure.
Before we go to that, I want you guys to actually look up the just Bricklin car, because this one actually looked pretty sweet. It was like a strange mix of like a DeLorean and a Corvette. Like, it had the wing opening doors and everything. So at least he tried to come up with something novel for that one.
He was the thing that fascinates me about this story is we're talking about the Yugo, but there is a book that came out in 1977 called The Bricklin. Like, he was infamous in automotive circles before he ever heard of the Yugo. So we've got two legendarily bad ideas on a collision course. On one hand, we have Malcolm Bricklin, the absolute worst that capitalism has to offer. He's a liar, he's a cheat, he's got ideas that he can't follow through on. This guy is just terrible. And then we have the best that communism has to offer, which is this tiny little car called the Yugo from Yugoslavia. And it was not, I will point out, the worst idea ever, because in the early 1980s, when Malcolm Bricklin has this idea, American auto manufacturers had started manufacturing more and more expensive cars and started to get out of the entry-level car market because there's not a lot of markup on those cars. You're not making much money. And so all of your major American manufacturers were really trying to get out of that cheapo car market. The Japanese, which had been filling that niche, had started to regulate themselves out of fear of being regulated by the Americans into exporting only a select number of cars to the US, which meant since they could only send so many, they would have to send the better quality ones that they could make money on. So America at this time was experiencing a little bit of a glut in the affordable new car market, and Malcolm Bricklin thought, I can make this work. And despite what we know about the Yugo now, at the time, people were very excited about this car because, as I mentioned earlier, prices were on the rise and the people looking for inexpensive vehicles needed something to buy. And when you advertise the Yugo, you show a picture of it. Nobody's ever bought one before. No one's ever seen it. People are used to buying these Japanese econo boxes, as they were called at the time. Very small, inexpensive cars, get great gas mileage, don't have a lot of room in them. And this looks like the second coming of the Japanese Econobox. Sure, it comes from a communist state. Sure, there's some weirdness with the Serbians that aren't really happy about buying things from Yugoslavia, and they have their whole deal. But Malcolm Bricklin doesn't care about that. He says cars don't have politics. We're going to bring these cars in. They're going to be great. People are going to love them. And guess what, Tony?
They're terrible cars.
People did love them.
Oh, that's not what I expected.
Bah, bah, bah. Yes, the initial reaction to the Yugo, even after people bought them, was very positive. They even had a term for it. They called it Yugomania. The Yugo America dealerships that Malcolm Bricklin had set up through his magical franchising abilities, because he loved to franchise stuff. They sold over 1,000 Yugos in one day. They didn't even have 1,000 Yugos at the time. There was 500 that they'd sent over, and there were people back ordering them. They were putting down deposit. People were excited for this car. They did amazing business. And Yugo of America was very, very excited. And just to drive home, this wasn't just a little flash in the pan. The Yugomania that I'm talking about was so powerful that Chrysler came to Yugo of America and said, listen, we want to buy your company. We got $15 million. And Yugo of America said, if you're offering us $15 million, you're Chrysler. Like, you've got the good ideas. You're already in the market. This must be an amazing idea. We would be fools to sell out now for $15 million when this could turn into $1 billion idea. The Yugo will go down in history as the greatest cheap car in the world. So they turned him down. They could have had their 15 mil. They started out with basically nothing. They turned him down. And here's where things start to go bad. Because the Yugo pointed out to manufacturers that there was a demand for these lower priced cars. And the problem for Yugo was, despite the fact that many manufacturers had gotten out of this market, it wasn't difficult for them to get back in and start competing. And they would maybe not make their own cheap cars, but they would import cars from other places like Japan that weren't communist run and were maybe a little bit better on the quality control. And even if they were cheap, they could do better work with their cars. Also, around this time, a little company that you might have heard of called Hyundai was making a move from Canada to the United States with exactly the same goal in mind: sell cheap cars to America. And Yugo's biggest problem was they lacked innovation, right? Because we're talking about a car from Yugoslavia, and in the communist country where this car came from, you were just happy to get a car. There was no innovation needed to drive sales. There was the one car that you could get, and if you wanted to get it, you signed up or you didn't. And that was the mindset. And so the Yugo was already 10 years out of date by the time it started getting sold in America. And in addition to that, Yugoslavia was super deep in debt. So even if they had wanted to innovate, they would not have been able to make the modifications to their factory because they didn't have the capital. In fact, in 1983, they had to borrow $600 million just to pay interest on their loans.
Whew, that's a heavy interest payment.
Yeah, that's you get that minimum payment on the credit card, and it's $600 million. You're having a rough time.
Yeah, if only the national debt limit was that low for our interest payment.
Ooh, sick burn with the current events.
Maybe that should be a bad idea someday.
Well, that one's still going on, Tony. We like to see the ones that are wrapped up.
That's true.
The second big problem for Yugo of America was that after Yugomania passed, the shoe had to drop. And as you know, people found out that the Yugo was not an amazing car. It had problems, and people started to talk about them. Specifically, and one of the biggest blows to Yugo was this really negative report that came out in the Consumer Reports the February after they released in America, which happened in 1985. So February of 1986, Consumer Reports buys a Yugo, puts it through its paces, and there's not very many paces for it to go through.
Yeah, especially because you can't even get up hills very easily in that thing with its, 45 horsepower engine?
That's why they call it the Yugo 45.
Proud of them 45 horses.
I read a book about this car, Tony, and a lot of the information I have for you guys today is coming from the book The Yugo, The Rise and Fall of the Worst Car in History by Jason Buick. And Jason Buick's view of the Yugo is that it is not the worst car. There are other very bad cars of the time. In fact, he argues that the Subaru 360 was much, much worse than the Yugo was. And much of the problem that the Yugo had was just that it was small. And when you have a tiny, tiny car like that, and Yugo wasn't the only one making a tiny, tiny car back then, but when you're dealing with a tiny car like that, there's just not the mass to have a safe driving experience. So if you get hit with something heavy, you are probably going to die. It wasn't even necessarily about bad engineering from a certain point of view. It was just the physics of having a small car. However, the negative word of mouth really, really caught on. And Yugo was caught super flat-footed because they were riding this wave of Yugomania. The positive buzz and everybody loving their cars and, the huge sales numbers that they did at first was all right in line with Malcolm Bricklin's unrealistic expectations, because he was always pitching way higher than anybody could ever expect to do. And here they were coming off of a really positive time. And when people started to talk negatively about the Yugo, they weren't ready. They had an advertising campaign from an ad agency that they just didn't pull the trigger on until after all of this negative press started building up. And by that time, it was just too late. Their car's name became synonymous with junk, Tony. And not only that, but was the punchline of many, many jokes. I mean, the Yugo joke was sort of like the anti-Chuck Norris joke of its day.
Oh, it was on like all the late night shows, like top 10 lists. All sorts of different ones were popping up just because it was so culturally just known to be bad.
Yes. But speaking of which, let's take a little break here and read some Yugo jokes. What comes with every Yugo user's manual, Tony?
I'm not sure what.
The bus schedule. Why does a Yugo have a rear window defroster?
So you can keep your hands warm while you push it?
What do you call a Yugo at the top of a big hill?
I don't know.
A miracle.
We actually saw that in some of the YouTube reviews we watched of this car, where like he's trying to go up not even a high grade hill. It's like at sea level, decent little hill, and he's dropping down to about like 18 to 20 miles per hour. His cars are flying past him going 60. It was not a fun time.
My favorite one is, why didn't the Yugo sustain much damage in the front end collision?
I don't know.
The tow truck took most of the damage. So you can imagine, as this meme starts to spread of the terrible Yugo, that things get real bad. And if that wasn't bad enough, they're known for being cheap, they're known for being unsafe, and later in 1986, the National Highway Transportation Safety Association orders a recall of every Yugo in America for a faulty seatbelt fastening mechanism. Now, it wasn't like a big deal to fix. It was a quick in and out, bolt, swap out a cheap part, and we're good. But you're already dealing with a firestorm of negativity about this car, and it hits hard in the reputation. Now, they do try to dig themselves out of the hole. Too late. In the summer of 1986, they unleash this media blitz. They buy lots and lots of commercials. All right, they're spending commercial advertising money at the rate of $800 per car sold.
And whenever you're selling a car for less than $5,000, I'm sure that totally pays off.
It did not, Tony. No spoilers for the end of this, but it turns out no, that idea was not good, not a good one. But their problem wasn't advertising, right? Like, the point of advertising is that so people know about your product. Everybody knew about the Yugo. The problem with the Yugo was it had become synonymous with cheapness. I mean, it was literally a joke, as we said. And the United States in the 1980s was going through a very heavy commercialism phase, a big sort of boom of you are what you own, right? The baby boomers had come up, they were doing good financially, they had lots of money, and people were buying stuff and identifying themselves with the stuff that they bought. And owning a Yugo identified you as a schmuck. It wasn't just that the car was inexpensive, it was that it had become a symbol of cheapness. You were not cool if you drove a Yugo. There was no way to be cool if you drove a Yugo. One of the jokes that they had was, what do teenagers think of the Yugo? No one knows, you can't get them in one. So Yugo eventually gets bailed out by some investors, on the condition that Malcolm Bricklin, who is living pretty high on the hog at this point, off in his ranch, he has to step down as CEO. And they try to turn the company around, but by then the damage to the brand was very severe. And on top of all of that, Zavasta, the Yugoslavian company that manufactured the Yugo, eventually started to collapse. Now, first of all, it's just because bad management, right? Because one of the biggest bad ideas ever is communism. I mean, I'm just going to throw that out there as like a blanket statement. Y'all can be mad if you want to, but it didn't work in this particular case anyway. And the poor management as a communist company really hurt them. And immediately following after that, they experienced the ethnic uprisings of the 1990s, which you'll remember with the Serbian-Croatian conflict. All of that stuff was parts of former Yugoslavia breaking apart. And one of the ways that Zavasta, the company that produced the Yugo, had organized their company was so that all of the production hubs were scattered throughout Yugoslavia. And when Yugoslavia broke apart, you couldn't get some of the pieces from the individual production hubs because they were now part of a different country or being held by a militia group from a rival faction. All of those things just totally tore the Yugo apart. And honestly, it's a little bit of a sad story because especially for the people who worked on the Yugo, these guys in Yugoslavia who, from all accounts, really seemed to take a lot of pride in this car that they were building. Yes, it was a crappy car. Yeah, the Yugoslavian management and the way that they sort of organized their factories meant that sometimes the work was uneven, let's say, to be generous. But especially the people who worked on the ones going to America were very excited that they got to work on a product that was going overseas and being sold and hopefully was being seen as something positive. And for all of them to lose that pride and then eventually to kind of lose their country, that kind of bummed me out, Tony. When I got to the end of the story, I was disappointed to find out just sort of all the bad things that happened to Yugoslavia. It wasn't even just beyond the Yugo itself. These people ended up not having a great life. And a little bit of it was Malcolm Bricklin's fault.
Well, he might have actually extended it for a little bit, like he was bringing them a different revenue stream for a while.
No, I hate Malcolm Bricklin. He doesn't get any props. He went on to do more failed ventures. He tried to sell an electric bike and an electric car in the 1990s. That didn't work out. He is still today trying to break into the electric car market. Good luck with that, dude, I guess.
He's going to be the next Tesla.
He's going to be
or
the
Elon
next
Musk, I guess.
P.T. Barnum, only without the actual business acumen to make something out of his lies. Not a fan of Malcolm Bricklin after having read this book.
Battery's 78 and he won't be much longer for this world.
Maybe, but I tell you what, someone like that who can cheat so many people out of so much money and not end up in jail at any point, that's what's wrong with this world, I think.
I'm reading an article right now that shows that he's trying to sell like this weird art thing for car dealerships. If they give him $2 million, he gets like these 3-wheeled battery-powered 2-seater vehicles and all this other stuff, and like an art gallery for their places. It's just bizarre that he's still out there just pushing. Part of me does admire how hard he works for this stuff, but he's just a con man who has a really, really good work ethic.
I have to admit, he is very hardworking. I do admire that. But he's not a good guy. And that he is at least a lot of the reason why the Yugo failed. The Yugo ultimately turned out to be a bad idea.
Thank you for listening to Bad Ideas. If you end up liking this podcast and want to support it, you can go to humanechoes.com and become a member, or you can check out the Patreon link under this video. We've been putting these podcasts together for a long time now. We're excited to see what you guys' responses are. If you would like to suggest a bad idea for us, hit us up at badideashow@gmail.com, and we'll consider the bad idea and see if it can make it onto an episode.
Thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you next week.
And one last thing, it is very important in these fledgling few episodes that we get some reviews and some likes over on iTunes, over on Google, on various other places where you can give podcast ratings. So keep that in mind. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.